In 1781, a 60-page argument buried inside an 800-page book quietly ended 2,000 years of philosophy. The book was the Critique of Pure Reason, and almost nobody understood it at first. Its first reviewers mistook it for a rehash of skepticism, and its author spent years writing corrections. Yet, within 2 decades, every serious thinker in Europe was working inside the framework it built. Schopenhauer called it the most important book ever written in Europe. Every philosopher we have covered on this channel, Nietzsche and Schopenhauer included, is answering Kant, whether they admit it or not. The book asks one question that sounds technical and turns out to be explosive. What can reason know when it works alone, without help from experience? Kant's answer destroyed rational proofs of God, dissolved the soul as an object of knowledge, and split reality in two. It also rescued science, rescued freedom, and gave the mind a dignity no philosopher had given it before. This video reconstructs the complete argument of the book, from its first page to its last, including the parts most summaries skip. Nothing here requires prior training. Everything here requires attention. Part 1. The crisis that made the book. Necessary. Start with a fact that embarrassed every philosopher alive in 1770. Physics worked and philosophy did not. Newton had published his laws of motion roughly a century earlier, and they delivered something astonishing. One set of equations predicted the fall of an apple and the orbit of the moon with equal precision. Astronomers used them to forecast eclipses decades in advance, and the eclipses arrived on schedule. Physics had found a method that produced agreement, accumulation, and progress. Metaphysics, the study of God, the soul, and the ultimate nature of reality, had produced none of these. It was the oldest discipline in Europe, and it could not settle a single question. Is the soul immortal? Did the universe have a beginning? Does God exist? After 2,000 years of brilliant minds, every one of these questions stood exactly where Plato left it. Kant called metaphysics a battlefield of endless controversies, and the description was simply accurate. The scandal was not that metaphysics had hard problems, since physics had hard problems too. The scandal was that metaphysics showed no mechanism for ever resolving them. Two great traditions claimed to explain knowledge, and each made the crisis worse. The rationalists, led by Leibniz and systematized in Germany by Christian Wolff, trusted pure thinking. On their view, reason could establish truths about reality the way geometry establishes truths about triangles. Sit in a chair, reason carefully, and you can prove the soul is a simple, immortal substance. Kant was raised inside this tradition and taught it for years. Its weakness was visible in its own results. Rationalist arguments were rigorous in form, yet equally rigorous arguments reached opposite conclusions. Pure thought, working alone, could apparently prove anything, which means it proved nothing. The empiricists, led by Locke and radicalized by Hume, trusted the senses. All knowledge begins with experience, and every idea must trace back to some impression. This sounded sober and scientific until Hume followed the principle to its conclusion. Take the concept of cause, the single most important concept in science. You believe fire causes heat, that one billiard ball makes the other move. Hume asked a devastating question. Which impression gives you the idea of making, of necessary connection? Watch the billiard balls as closely as you like. You see one ball move, then contact, then the second ball move. You see sequence. You never see necessity. Nothing in the scene shows that the second ball had to move. Hume's conclusion was that causation, as a necessary connection, is not something we observe or prove. It is a habit. After watching similar sequences repeat, the mind develops an expectation and projects it onto the world. The foundation of all science is, on this account, a psychological reflex of ours. Notice what this destroys if it stands. Newton's laws claim necessity and universality, that every event must follow from its causes, everywhere and always. Habit can never justify a claim of that strength, since habit only reports what has happened so far. Empiricism, pursued honestly, ends by undermining the one science that actually worked. Kant later wrote that the memory of David Hume interrupted his dogmatic slumber. The phrase is famous, but the precise nature of the interruption matters more than the drama. Kant saw that Hume's argument was not a clever puzzle to be patched. It was a correct deduction from empiricist premises, which meant the premises themselves had to be wrong. But the rationalist premises were also wrong, as the battlefield of metaphysics proved. Both available theories of knowledge were broken, and one of them broke physics with it. In February 1772, Kant wrote a letter to his student Marcus Hertz that contains the seed of everything. He asked what he called the key question of metaphysics, hidden until now. On what ground does a representation inside my mind relate to an object outside it? If the object stamps itself onto the mind, knowledge is just passive reception and necessity is inexplicable. If the mind creates the object as God might, then human knowledge would be invention, not discovery. Human minds clearly do neither, and no existing philosophy explained what they do instead. Kant then went nearly silent for almost a decade, publishing close to nothing while he rebuilt philosophy from the ground. Friends mocked the endless delay of his promised book. When the Critique of Pure Reason finally appeared in 1781, he claimed the silence had been the work. The first task of that work was to state the crisis with a precision nobody had achieved. Hume had divided all knowledge into two boxes, and his skepticism depended on the division being complete. Kant's opening move was to show that the most important knowledge we possess fits in neither box. Part 2. The question hidden in plain sight. Synthetic judgments, a priori. Hume sorted every meaningful statement into two categories, and the sorting felt exhaustive. First, relations of ideas. A triangle has three sides, and all bachelors are unmarried. These are necessarily true, knowable by thought alone, and completely uninformative about the world. Deny one and you contradict yourself, because the predicate just unpacks the subject. Second, matters of fact. The water is cold and the sun rose this morning. These are informative, knowable only through observation, and never necessary. The sun might not rise tomorrow, and no contradiction follows from supposing it. Necessity without information, or information without necessity. Choose one. Kant's first move was to replace this single division with two independent ones, and the distinction changed everything. One division concerns the source of a judgment. A priori, judgments can be justified independently of experience, while a posteriori judgments require experience for their justification. The other division concerns the structure of a judgment. In an analytic judgment, the predicate is already contained in the concept of the subject. All bachelors are unmarried adds nothing, since unmarried is part of what bachelor means. In a synthetic judgment, the predicate adds something genuinely new to the subject. The cat is asleep tells you something the concept of cat does not contain. Cross the two divisions, and you get four possible kinds of judgment. Analytic a priori judgments exist, and they are Hume's relations of ideas, true but empty. Synthetic a posteriori judgments exist, and they are Hume's matters of fact, informative but contingent. Analytic a posteriori judgments are impossible, since unpacking a concept never requires observation. That leaves the fourth box. The one Hume's framework silently assumed was empty. Synthetic a priori judgments would be informative about the world, yet justified independently of all experience. They would extend our knowledge while carrying strict necessity and universality. The entire fate of metaphysics and of science hangs on whether this box has anything in it. Kant argues that it does, and his first exhibit is mathematics. Take the judgment that 7 plus 5 equals 12. It is clearly a priori, since you do not verify it by counting apples and waiting for exceptions. It holds necessarily in every possible world, and observation could never overturn it. The deeper question is whether it is analytic, and Kant answers no. Analyze the concept of 7, the concept of 5, and the concept of their sum. You find the thought of two numbers combined into one, but you do not find 12. To reach 12, you must actually carry out the combination, counting through on fingers or points. The result is constructed, not extracted, by analysis. With large numbers, this becomes obvious, since no one claims the answer to a huge addition hides inside its question. Geometry makes the same point with more force. The straight line between 2 points is the shortest one. Straight is a concept about direction, and shortest is a concept about magnitude. No analysis of direction yields magnitude, so the judgment is synthetic. Yet every geometer treats it as necessary and proves theorems from it without checking the world. Honesty requires a note here, because this exhibit was attacked from two later directions. Frege argued in 1884 that arithmetic is analytic after all, reducible to pure logic, though his program hit serious trouble. Non-Euclidean geometry raised a harder problem we will face in Part 4 directly. What survives every attack is the structure of Kant's question, even where his examples are contested. The second exhibit is natural science itself. Every alteration has a cause. This is precisely the principle Hume could not justify, and Kant agrees with Hume's analysis completely. The principle is not analytic, since the concept of an event contains no reference to a cause. Something could begin to happen, and no contradiction arises from supposing it began from nothing. The principle is also not a posteriori, and this is where Kant sharpens Hume's own point. Experience shows you what happens, never what must happen. No number of observed cases can ever underwrite the words every and must. Yet science is not merely committed to this principle. Science is unintelligible without it, since an uncaused exception would not refute a law, but merely escape it. You rely on this structure every day without noticing. Your phone screen goes black and you check the battery, the button, the charger. What you never do is conclude that the screen went black for no reason at all. That option is not on your list, and not because experience crossed it off. Experience could never cross it off, since experience only shows the causes you find, not the impossibility of their absence. You are treating a synthetic principle as necessary, exactly as Newton did. So the strange box is occupied. Mathematics fills it, the foundations of physics fill it, and metaphysics has always claimed to fill it. This converts the crisis of Part 1 into a single answerable question, the question of the whole book. How are synthetic a priori judgments possible? How can a mind, before any experience, know truths that hold for all experience? Every existing theory of knowledge makes this impossible, because every existing theory shares one silent assumption. Knowledge must conform to objects. Kant's answer required deleting that assumption, and it is the most consequential deletion in modern thought. Part 3. The Copernican Reversal. Make the impossibility explicit first, because the reversal only makes sense once the old picture visibly fails. Assume knowledge works the way everyone assumed, with the mind conforming to objects. Objects exist out there with their properties, and knowing is receiving an accurate imprint of them. On this picture, where could knowledge of necessity come from? Premise 1. All information about objects reaches the mind through their effects on the senses. Premise 2. The senses only ever report what is the case, never what must be the case. Conclusion. A mind that conforms to objects can never know necessary truths about them. But mathematics and the causal principle are necessary truths, and we possess them. So the picture is not incomplete, it is false. Kant's alternative is stated in the preface to the second edition, in a passage that named a revolution. Until now, philosophy assumed that all our knowledge must conform to objects, and every attempt failed. So, run the experiment in reverse. Assume instead that objects must conform to our knowledge, to the structure of the knowing mind. Kant compared the move to Copernicus, who explained the rotating heavens by making the observer move instead. The comparison is precise in one respect. Both men explained an observed pattern by relocating its source from the world to the spectator. State the new picture carefully, because it is misread more often than any idea in philosophy. Kant is not claiming that thinking makes things exist, or that reality is a private dream. The claim concerns form, not existence. The mind does not create the matter of experience, which is given to it from elsewhere. The mind contributes a structure within which anything can be given at all. Whatever shows up in experience must show up in space, in time, ordered by causal law. Not because the world in itself is built that way, but because those are the mind's conditions of receiving anything. A concrete case shows the logic. A camera sensor records every scene it will ever capture as a rectangular grid of pixels. You can know before the camera leaves the factory that every future photograph will be pixelated and rectangular. This is genuine advanced knowledge of all possible photographs, and it is absolutely certain. Its source is obvious, since the grid belongs to the instrument, not to the landscapes, and the same fact that grants the certainty sets its limit. The grid tells you nothing about the landscape as it is apart from being photographed. Advanced knowledge of appearances, total silence about things apart from appearing. That trade is the entire Kantian bargain in miniature. Now the explanation of the strange box becomes visible. Synthetic a priori knowledge is possible about exactly one domain, the domain of possible experience. Geometry holds necessarily for everything we will ever perceive, because space is our form of perceiving. The causal principle holds necessarily for everything that will ever happen for us, because causality is our form of understanding. Necessity, which no object could ever teach us, is legible at last. It is the mind reading its own constitution off the surface of the world. Kant called his method transcendental, and the term needs one sentence of definition. Transcendental inquiry does not study objects, but studies the conditions that make experience of objects possible. It asks what must already be in place for there to be a world for you at all. And he called the resulting doctrine Transcendental Idealism, paired with a claim he insisted on equally. Empirical realism. Within experience, tables and planets are fully real, public, and independent of your wishes. The ideality enters only at the level of form, of space and time themselves. This picture has returned to the centre of current science, in a specific and named way. The dominant framework in computational neuroscience, called predictive processing, treats perception as controlled construction rather than passive reception. On this account, the brain continuously generates a model of the world and corrects it against sensory error signals. Its leading theorists, Carl Friston, Jacob Howe, Andy Clark, and Anil Seth, describe experience as the brain's best hypothesis. Seth calls perception a controlled hallucination, and recent philosophical work argues this framework lands remarkably close to transcendental idealism. The convergence does not prove Kant right, since his argument was about justification, not brain mechanics. It shows something narrower and still striking. When science finally modelled perception rigorously, it abandoned the imprint picture exactly where Kant did. The reversal also carries its famous cost, stated here and examined fully in Part 10. If we only ever know things as structured by our forms, things as they are in themselves remain unknowable. Not unknown, awaiting better instruments, but unknowable in principle, since every instrument is ours. Kant accepted the cost openly, and his successors fought over it for 2 centuries. So far, the reversal is a hypothesis, an experiment proposed but not run. Saying that objects conform to the mind earns nothing until Kant identifies the actual structures they conform to. He must catalogue the mind's contributions one by one and prove each is genuinely a priori. The catalogue begins where all experience begins, with the sheer receiving of the world through the senses. Kant's first discovery there is the strangest claim in the book. Space and time are not out there. Part 4. Space and time are not what you think, the transcendental aesthetic. Kant divides the mind's contribution into 2 layers, and the book's architecture follows the division. Sensibility is the capacity to receive representations, to be given an object in what he calls intuition. Understanding is the capacity to think objects through concepts. Intuitions without concepts are blind, and thoughts without content are empty, in his most quoted line. The transcendental aesthetic studies the first layer, asking whether sensibility itself has a priori form. Aesthetic here means the theory of sense perception, not the theory of beauty. The common sense view deserves its day in court first. Space seems to be a vast container, existing out there, holding every object, whether perceived or not. Newton held essentially this view, treating absolute space as a real cosmic arena. Leibniz held the main rival view, on which space is nothing but a system of relations among things. Both views agree on one thing, that space belongs to the world side of the ledger. Kant argues both are wrong, through a series of compact arguments called the metaphysical exposition. The first argument runs from priority in experience. To perceive objects as outside you and outside each other, you must already represent them in space. Spatial representation cannot be learned from experience of outer things, since it is presupposed by any such experience. The empiricist story, where a child abstracts the idea of space from seeing arrangements, gets the order backward. Seeing an arrangement already is representing things spatially. The second argument runs from the imagination's limits. You can think of space as empty of all objects, however hard the thought is to hold. You cannot represent the absence of space itself. Try to think of 2 objects with no spatial relation, neither distance nor direction between them. The attempt does not produce a strange picture. It produces no picture. For Kant, this asymmetry signals that space belongs to the perceiving apparatus, not the perceived inventory. A further pair of arguments establishes something subtler, that space is an intuition rather than a concept. A concept is a general feature shared by many instances, the way redness covers many red things. Space is not like that, since particular spaces are not instances of space, but pieces of it. There is one space, and every region is carved from that single given whole. The whole precedes the parts, which is exactly the reverse of how concepts work. So space is a pure intuition, a singular form in which the world is given. Here is a concrete case where this form does visible philosophical work. Hold your left hand beside your right hand. Describe each one exhaustively from the inside, listing every distance between every pair of points on each hand. The 2 descriptions come out identical, since a left hand is internally just like a right hand. Yet the hands are not interchangeable, as anyone forcing a left glove onto a right hand discovers. Kant called such pairs incongruent counterparts. Their difference is real, graspable instantly in perception, and invisible to any catalogue of internal conceptual relations. Leibniz's relational theory has no resources to state what makes the hands differ. Kant's diagnosis is that handedness lives in the relation to space as a given whole. Some perceptual content outruns every concept, which is precisely what a pure intuition should predict. Then comes the transcendental exposition, which argues from geometry back to the nature of space. Geometry delivers synthetic a priori knowledge, as Part 2 established. Ask what space would have to be for such a science to be possible. If space were a feature of things in themselves, geometric knowledge of it would require experience and lose necessity. Only if space is the form of our outer intuition, contributed by us, can we know its structure a priori. The same template then runs for time, the form of inner sense. Every state you will ever have, every thought and pang and perception arrives ordered in time. Arithmetic for Kant is grounded in this temporal form, in counting as successive construction. The conclusion is transcendental idealism applied to both forms. Space and time are empirically real, holding without exception for every object of any possible human experience. And they are transcendentally ideal, meaning things in themselves are neither spatial nor temporal. The universe considered apart from us does not sit in a place and does not flow. Even your own self, as it is in itself, is not in time. You appear to yourself, Kant says, and the appearing has a form you supplied. Two major objections have defined the afterlife of this doctrine, and both must be faced at strength. The first is called the neglected alternative, pressed hardest by Adolf Trendelenburg in the 19th century. Kant shows that space is the subjective form of our intuition. He concludes that things in themselves are not spatial. But a third option sits untouched between these claims. Space could be our subjective form, and also, by coincidence or design, a feature of things in themselves. Kant needs to rule this out, and the text never clearly does. Defenders reply that necessity is the missing premise, since a happy coincidence could not ground knowing geometry must hold. The exchange continues in the journals today, and neither side has clearly won. The second objection came from physics, and it looked fatal for a century. Mathematicians in the 19th century constructed consistent geometries in which Euclid's axioms fail. Then general relativity declared that physical space and time are curved by matter, and measurement agreed. Kant's exhibit of synthetic a priori knowledge, Euclidean geometry, turned out to be empirically false of the world. Hermann von Helmholtz and later Hans Reichenbach built careers on this refutation. The strong Kantian claim that Euclidean space is fixed forever in human sensibility is dead, and honesty says so plainly. What survived is more interesting than what died. Reichenbach and, in current philosophy of science, Michael Friedman argue that relativity still needs constitutive principles fixed in advance. Coordinating definitions and mathematical frameworks must be in place before any measurement can confirm or refute anything. The a priori survives, relativized to a framework and revisable between frameworks, but never absent. Neuroscience has also re-entered this old argument with specific findings. John O'Keefe discovered place cells, neurons encoding location, and May Britt and Edvard Moser discovered grid cells, which tile the environment in hexagonal coordinates. The work earned the 2014 Nobel Prize and shows the brain arriving equipped with dedicated spatial structuring machinery. The finding does not confirm Kant, whose claim concerned justification rather than neural hardware. But the empiricist picture it replaced, of spatial order passively absorbed from the world, was Kant's target too. Grant the aesthetic, everything it claims, and a gap immediately opens. Structured receiving is still only receiving. A creature with spatial and temporal forms would have ordered sensations flowing past and nothing more. It would not perceive objects, track them, or think a single thought about them. Experience requires a second contribution, an active one, and Kant must now identify its machinery. Part 5. The Mind's Machinery. Concepts, Judgments, and the 12 Categories. Kant's example from a companion work shows exactly what is still missing. You stand in the morning sun beside a stone, and the stone grows warm. Sensibility delivers everything it can deliver, brightness, then warmth, one after another, in time. Notice what that sequence does not contain. It does not contain the thought that the sun warms the stone. Felt succession says only this, then that. The judgment says something categorically stronger, that the warmth came from the sunlight, that one produced the other. Hume saw this gap and concluded the stronger thought was an illusion of habit. Kant draws the opposite lesson. Since the stronger thought is not given by the senses, some faculty must actively contribute it. That faculty is the understanding, and Kant defines its operation with precision. The understanding is the capacity to judge, and concepts are its instruments. A concept, for Kant, is best understood as a rule. The concept dog is a rule for uniting features, forelegs, fur, barking, into one stable object of thought. The concept body is a rule demanding extension, shape, and impenetrability wherever it is applied. To perceive a world rather than a flux is to be constantly silently applying rules. Kant's question then becomes beautifully direct. Are all such rules learned from experience, or does the understanding contribute rules of its own? His strategy for finding out is called the metaphysical deduction, and it works backward from logic. Every concept, whatever its content, gets used in exactly one way, inside judgments. So, if the understanding has native rules, they will show up as the basic forms of judgment itself. Logicians had catalogued those forms for 2,000 years. Every judgment has a quantity, applying to all, some, or one. Every judgment has a quality, affirming, denying, or limiting. Every judgment has a relation, either predicate to subject or consequence to ground, or members to a system. Every judgment has a modality, marking it possible, actual, or necessary. 4 headings, 3 forms each, 12 forms of judgment in total. Now comes the pivotal step. Each form of judging, applied not to other concepts but to the raw material of the senses, becomes a category. A category is a pure concept of the understanding, a rule for structuring any possible object whatsoever. The judgment form of subject and predicate becomes the category of substance, the thought of a persisting bearer of properties. The form of ground and consequence becomes the category of causality, the thought of necessary production. The form linking members reciprocally becomes community, the thought of interaction. Quantity yields unity, plurality and totality, the conceptual machinery behind all counting. Quality yields reality, negation and limitation. Modality yields possibility, existence and necessity. 12 categories mirroring 12 judgment forms claimed as the complete inventory of the understanding's native equipment. Watch the inventory operate in one ordinary perception. You glance at a coffee cup, look away, and look back. You take it to be the same cup, one enduring thing rather than two resembling appearances. That is the category of substance working, since sameness over interrupted viewing is never itself seen. You take the cup to be one object with many features, white, curved, hot. That is unity binding plurality. You take it that the cup would burn you if grabbed, a fact about possibility no glance contains. Strip these contributions away, and the cup does not become a simpler object. It stops being an object at all, dissolving into unclaimed colours and shapes. The metaphysical deduction has drawn serious fire, and the fire should be felt. Hegel complained that Kant found his categories rather than derived them, lifting a table from textbook logic without proving its necessity. Strawson, 2 centuries later, judged the derivation one of the least convincing stretches of the book. The complaint has real force. Why exactly 12 forms? Why these headings? Modern logic, after Frege, carves judgment quite differently, treating quantifiers and connectives in ways Kant never anticipated. Some scholars, following Klaus Reich and more recently Michael Wolff, argue the table has an inner systematic order after all. The majority view concedes the catalogue is less secure than Kant believed, while holding that his deeper claim survives. The deeper claim is that some native conceptual structure or other is required, whatever its exact census. And that deeper claim now faces its own crisis, one Kant himself states with alarming candour. Suppose the inventory is correct, and these 12 really are the mind's native rules. A skeptic can grant all of it, and then ask the question that matters. What right do you have to apply your rules to the world? Space and time enjoyed an easy security, since nothing can even appear without entering them. Concepts have no such guarantee. Kant admits that appearances could conceivably stream through our senses in utter disorder, offering causality nothing to grip. The sun could rise in chaos tomorrow, and sensibility would receive it perfectly well. Categories might then be merely ours, an elaborate filing system the world ignores. Hume would win after all, at a deeper level. Kant's answer to this threat is the Transcendental Deduction, the argument he called the most difficult ever undertaken in metaphysics. Part 6. The hardest argument. Kant ever wrote, the Transcendental Deduction. The word deduction here is borrowed from law, not logic, and the borrowing defines the task. 18th century jurists distinguished questions of fact from questions of right, quid facti from quid juris. That we use the categories is a fact. The deduction must establish the right, proving the categories validly apply to everything the senses could ever deliver. Kant rewrote the entire argument for the 1787 second edition, and the rewrite is now standard. What follows reconstructs that B version, premise by premise. The argument starts from the thinnest fact available, so thin no skeptic can refuse it. Kant states it in the most famous sentence of the book. The I think must be able to accompany all my representations. Unpack it slowly. Any representation that is mine, any thought or perception I have, must be one I could ascribe to myself. A perception I could not even in principle attach to my I think would be nothing to me. It might occur in my brain, but it would not figure in my mental life at all. This is not a claim that you constantly think about yourself. It is a claim about a standing possibility, built into what makes any experience someone's experience. Kant names this condition the transcendental unity of apperception. Premise 2 states what that unity costs. My representations do not come labelled as mine, the way sheep come branded. For many representations to belong to one consciousness, they must be combinable into one connected whole. Kant's term for combining is synthesis, and he insists synthesis is always an act. Connection is the one thing that can never be passively received through any sense. The world can give you this and that, but never the and. A melody makes the premise concrete and does real work here. Someone hums 4 notes to you across 4 seconds. When the 4th note sounds, the first 3 are physically gone, no longer striking your ear. Hearing a melody, rather than 4 orphaned tones, requires holding the dead notes, reproducing them, and binding all 4 into one object. 3 acts, which Kant calls apprehension, reproduction, and recognition, running silently in every second of your life. Now notice the connection to premise 1. A consciousness that performed no such binding would not be a unified consciousness of anything. It would be a scatter of momentary flashes, each instantly orphaned, no one home to whom they all belong. The unity of the self and the act of synthesis are 2 sides of a single coin. Premise 3 asks what governs the binding, and here the categories finally enter. Synthesis cannot be arbitrary, since arbitrary grouping would yield private whim, not one objective consciousness. Binding representations into one experience means binding them according to rules, and the most general rules of combination, Kant argues, are precisely the forms of judgment in their object-directed use. Those are the categories, by the result of Part 5. Now assemble the whole argument. Anything that is experience at all must belong to one self-consciousness. Belonging to one self-consciousness requires rule-governed synthesis. The fundamental rules of synthesis are the categories. Therefore, the categories necessarily apply to every possible object of experience. The skeptic's nightmare of lawless appearances is closed off, not because the world is kind, but because lawless appearances could never enter any unified experience to begin with. Something further falls out of this argument, and it is one of Kant's deepest results. Ask what objectivity itself amounts to. What makes a perception count as perception of an object? You cannot step outside experience to compare your representation with a bare object. Kant's answer is that objectivity just is a certain necessary unity among representations. The judgment that the stone is warm because of the sun claims a connection valid for everyone, anyone, always. Object talk is rule talk. The very distinction between how things seem to me and how they are is manufactured by the categories. That is why the categories cannot fail to fit objects. They are what being an object consists in for any experiencer like us. The B deduction has a famous structural puzzle, identified by Dieter Henrich in 1969 and debated ever since. Kant seems to prove his conclusion twice, once around section 20 and again around section 26. Henrich argued the proof has two deliberate steps. The first shows categories govern any intuition that gets unified into cognition. The second shows they reach everything given in our space and time at all, closing a loophole the first step left open. Whether the second step succeeds is exactly where the sharpest current controversy lives. That controversy is the conceptualism debate, and it is the most active dispute in present Kant scholarship. Conceptualist readers, including John McDowell and scholars such as Aaron Griffith and Anil Gomes, take the deductions lesson strictly. No perception, no intuition of any object occurs without the categories already at work. Non-conceptualists, led by Robert Hanna and Lucy Allais, point to passages where Kant says, intuition precedes all thinking. Animals and infants, lacking concepts, still perceptually navigate a spatial world. Hanna presses the problem as a gap in the B deduction itself. If intuitions can present objects without categories, then rogue appearances, given but unruled, remain possible after all. And then the deduction has not closed the skeptic's escape route. Allais defends a moderate version where intuition alone presents particulars, while full experience of an objective world still requires the categories. The dispute is not antiquarian bookkeeping. It is the live question of whether mind reaches the world first through concepts or beneath them, fought today in philosophy of perception under the same flags. One older criticism also deserves its full weight. Strawson's 1966 reconstruction tried to rescue the deduction as pure analysis while amputating what he called its transcendental psychology. All the talk of faculties and acts of synthesis struck him as mythology about the mind's hidden workshop. Paul Guyer pressed a related charge, that the official argument keeps sliding between a harmless premise and an ambitious conclusion. From the claim that I can ascribe all my representations to myself, Kant needs necessary connection among them. Whether any reading secures that step without smuggling, scholars still dispute, and pretending otherwise would falsify the record. What nobody disputes is the argument's gravitational pull. Analytic philosophy's transcendental arguments against skepticism from Strawson to today all descend from these 20 pages. Suppose the deduction succeeds completely, and the categories hold for all possible experience by right. A strange practical problem instantly surfaces, and Kant, with characteristic honesty, raises it himself. The categories are pure, utterly without sensory content, while everything the senses deliver is concrete and particular. Causality as a pure form contains no image, no feel, nothing perceptible. How does a contentless rule ever recognize its instances in the sensory stream? How does pure substance find the coffee cup? The two layers of the mind, so carefully separated, now need a bridge between them. Kant builds it in a short chapter he considered among the most important in the book, and its engineer is the imagination. Part 7. The Bridge Problem, Schematism and the Role of Imagination. The problem this chapter solves sounds technical until you see that you solve it every waking second. Applying a concept to a perception is called subsumption, and subsumption normally works through resemblance. The concept plate and the perceived plate share roundness, so the fit is easy to see. But the categories share nothing perceptible with anything. Causality is not round, not coloured, not loud. It is a pure form of judgment with no image at all. The concept and the sensory material are heterogeneous, alien to each other in kind. Some third thing must mediate, sharing the purity of the category and the concreteness of sense. Kant finds the third thing in time, and the choice is brilliant once stated. Time is pure, since it comes from us as the form of all inner sense. And time is in everything, since every perception we will ever have arrives temporally ordered. Time touches both shores. So Kant translates each category into a temporal rule, a procedure for organizing the time order of perceptions. He calls each translation a schema, and the translating faculty is the imagination. Imagination here does not mean fantasy or daydreaming. Kant means the capacity to generate and handle structured images, to render rules into perceivable shape. Watch it work on an ordinary concept first. Your concept of a dog fits dachshunds, mastiffs, and street mutts you have never seen. No single stored picture could do that, since any picture is too specific. A picture of a mastiff resembles other mastiffs and quietly excludes the dachshund. What you actually possess, Kant argues, is a schema, a flexible procedure for constructing dog shapes in general. The schema is not an image, but a rule for producing images, a recipe rather than a photograph. Now apply the machinery to the categories where the real work happens. The schema of substance is permanence, the rule of something persisting through all change in time. The schema of causality is regular succession, the rule of one state following another according to a fixed order. The schema of actuality is existence at some determinate time, and necessity is existence at all times. The schema of magnitude is number itself, the procedure of successively adding unit to unit. Notice what these translations achieve. The empty category of cause becomes a usable test. A temporal pattern perception can actually exhibit. Pure thought has been given hands. The chapter also delivers a quiet, sharp restriction that the rest of the book will enforce. The categories only ever apply through their schemata, and schemata are made of time. Strip time away, and the category of substance shrinks to an empty thought of a subject in general. It can no longer pick out anything. So the categories are valid for whatever appears in time, and meaningless beyond it. Remember this restriction. It is the loaded weapon Kant will fire at the soul, the cosmos, and God. This short chapter has had a strange double afterlife. dismissed and revered in equal measure. Early critics found it artificial, a forced symmetry papering over a problem Kant invented himself. If concepts just are rules for synthesis, as the Deduction said, why do rules need further rules to apply them? The objection threatens a regress, since the schema is itself a rule needing application. Wittgenstein later made this regressive rule following famous, and the schematism sits squarely in its blast radius. Kant's implicit answer is that the regress must stop in a capacity that is not another rule. Imagination is his name for the stopping point, an art, he says, hidden in the depths of the human soul. Heidegger built an entire reading of Kant on that sentence, taking imagination as the concealed common root of sense and understanding. The hidden art has since become a concrete engineering problem, and the comparison is exact rather than decorative. Classical artificial intelligence tried to make machines recognize objects through explicit definitions, necessary and sufficient conditions. The approach failed for decades, and it failed at precisely Kant's joint. No definition of dog written in rules ever covered the dachshund and excluded the wolf reliably. Modern neural networks succeeded by abandoning definitions for trained procedures, flexible mappings tuned across millions of examples. Eleanor Roche's prototype experiments in the 1970s had already shown human concepts behave this way, graded and procedural rather than definitional. Subsumption, the step Kant said required a special hidden faculty, really is computationally deep. The schematism marked the right mystery 2 centuries before anyone could model it. With the bridge built, Kant can finally collect his winnings. Categories plus schemata yield principles, actual synthetic a priori laws holding for every possible object of experience. These principles are the buried treasure of the entire enterprise, the replacement for the failed metaphysics of Part 1. Kant organizes them into a complete system, and the system contains his direct answer to Descartes. Part 8. The System of Principles, Mathematics in Nature, Degrees of Reality, and the Refutation of Idealism. The principles come in 4 groups, mirroring the 4 headings of the categories. Kant calls the first 2 groups mathematical because they license applying mathematics to nature. He calls the last 2 dynamical because they govern existence and connection. The third group, the Analogies of experience, carries the deepest cargo and gets the next part to itself. This part covers the first, second, and fourth groups, plus the argument Kant inserted among them in 1787. That insertion, the Refutation of Idealism, is 2 pages long and aims at Descartes' throat. The first principle is called the Axioms of Intuition, and it states that all intuitions are extensive magnitudes. An extensive magnitude is one where the whole is built from parts, the way a line accumulates from segments. Because space and time are the forms of everything given comes as such a magnitude. The consequence is enormous and easy to miss. Geometry and arithmetic are guaranteed in advance to apply to every object nature will ever present. That guarantee is what physics silently spends every day. When an engineer trusts that equations will keep matching steel and current, she is drawing on this principle. The astonishing effectiveness of mathematics in nature, which Eugene Wigner later called an unreasonable gift, has, on Kant's account, a reason. Mathematics describes the form of our receiving, and nothing escapes the form. The second principle, the anticipations of perception, is stranger and bolder. It concerns not the form of perception, but its matter, sensation itself. Kant claims every sensation has an intensive magnitude, a degree which can rise or fall continuously towards zero. The warmth on your skin, the brightness in your eyes, the pressure in your grip, all admit of more and less. We can know this a priori before meeting any particular sensation, which is why it is called an anticipation. The principle quietly forbids a certain picture of reality as binary presence and absence. The real comes in degrees, filling space and time with continuous intensity. Physics later made degree its native language, with field strengths, charge densities and amplitudes varying continuously across space. Kant, writing a century before field theory, had argued that reality must be measurable in exactly this style. The fourth group, the postulates of empirical thought, redefines three words philosophers had abused for millennia: possible, actual, and necessary. For Kant, these are not properties sitting inside things, but markers of how a thing relates to our cognition. The possible is whatever agrees with the formal conditions of experience, with space, time, and the categories. The actual is whatever connects to some perception, directly or through lawful inference. The necessary is whatever follows from the actual by causal law. Notice what just died. The rationalist habit of arguing from logical possibility to real possibility is now bankrupt. A concept free of contradiction, like a soul without a body, earns nothing by its mere consistency. Real possibility must be purchased from experience, and speculative metaphysics has no currency. Within this fourth section, Kant detonates his answer to a scandal he names explicitly. The scandal of philosophy, he says, is that the existence of outer things still rested on mere faith. Descartes had made inner experience the fortress, treating, I think, as certain and the external world as inference. On that picture you know your own mind immediately, while tables and other people remain a hypothesis. 2 centuries of philosophers accepted the fortress and merely argued about the drawbridge. Kant's refutation of idealism burns the fortress down instead. The argument runs in 3 tight steps, and each deserves separate weight. Premise 1. I am conscious of my own existence as ordered in time. This thought before that one. Even Descartes needs this premise, since the cogito is an episode in a biography. Premise 2. All time determination requires something permanent against which change is measured. A sequence is only a sequence relative to something that persists through it. Premise 3, the permanent cannot be found inside me, since inner life is sheer flowing change. The I think is itself just another episode, not an abiding measuring rod. Conclusion, the permanent that makes my inner timeline possible must be something outer, actual things in space. Inner experience, the skeptic's safe house, is only possible through outer experience. The doubt presupposes what it doubts. This argument's shape matters more than its century because the skeptic it targets keeps returning in new clothes. The brain in a vat and the simulation hypothesis both replay Descartes' move, granting inner certainty and outsourcing the world. Kant's reply pattern is the one still used against them. Show that the skeptic's own starting point, a self with an ordered mental history, already smuggles in the contested world. Whether Kant's version succeeds is genuinely disputed, and the dispute should be stated honestly. Critics from his own day onward pressed one sharp question. Does the argument prove permanent things, or merely my representation of permanent things? Paul Guyer reconstructs a version he thinks works, while others find the gap unbridged. Kant himself kept rewriting the proof in private notes until his death, which tells you he felt the pressure. One group of principles remains, and it is the group the whole book exists to secure. The analogies of experience govern persistence, succession, and coexistence, the deep grammar of any objective world. Among them sits Kant's direct, long-promised answer to Hume on causation. It is the most discussed argument in the critique, and it earns the discussion. Part 9. How Experience Gets Its Laws. Substance, Causality, and the Analogies. The three analogies share one problem, and seeing it makes them one argument rather than three. You never perceive time itself. You perceive happenings in time, but the container, the universal clock, never appears. Yet experience constantly makes claims about objective time, about what persisted, what followed, what coexisted. Since time itself cannot be read off perception, something must stand in for it. The analogies name the three stand-ins, and each is a category wearing its schema. The first analogy claims that beneath all change, something permanent persists, and its quantity never alters. The argument leans on the result just one in the Refutation. Change is only perceivable as change of something, an alteration in a persisting substrate. If things could blink into existence from nothing, no experience could even register the event as a happening. There would be two unrelated worlds before and after, with no thread between them. The unity of time requires substance, and substance to do its job can never be created or destroyed. Before dismissing this as armchair physics, look at how chemistry was actually born. When Lavoisier weighed sealed vessels before and after combustion, matter seemed to vanish into flame. He did not conclude that some matter simply ceases. He concluded the missing mass must have gone somewhere, hunted it, and found oxygen chemistry. The conservation commitment was not a finding of the experiment, but its precondition. The same pattern recurred in 1930, when beta decay seemed to delete energy. Wolfgang Pauli postulated an invisible particle to carry the missing amount, rather than surrender conservation. The neutrino was detected 26 years later. Scientists treat conservation principles exactly as Kant said they must, as rules constitutive of experience rather than lessons from it. The second analogy is the answer to Hume, and it turns on a beautifully simple observation. Compare two experiences, borrowed from Kant himself. You stand before a house, and your eyes wander from roof to door to windows. You watch a ship drift downstream, seeing it first upstream, then under the bridge, then beyond. In both cases, your perceptions arrive in sequence, one after another. Yet you judge the house perceptions to be of coexisting parts, and the ship perceptions to be of an objective event. The raw material is the same, sequence in you. The difference must come from somewhere, and it cannot come from the stream of sense itself. Kant locates the difference in reversibility. Looking at the house, you could have run the sequence backward, door before roof, at will. Watching the ship, you could not. Downstream before upstream was never available, whatever you did with your eyes. To experience an objective event just is to take the order of perceptions as bound, fixed, necessitated. And order necessitated by the prior state of things is precisely the schema of causality. So the concept Hume hunted for among impressions and could not find was never going to be there. Causality is not an item in experience. It is the rule that first separates events from wandering glances, the condition under which there are happenings at all. Hume asked where the idea of necessity comes from, and Kant answers from the same place as objects themselves. The strongest objection to this argument has a famous name and must be given its full force. Strawson called it a non sequitur of numbing grossness, and his charge is precise. Kant shows that perceiving an event involves taking the perceptual order as irreversible. The conclusion Kant wants is that every event follows from a prior state by a universal causal law. Between conceptual irreversibility and law-governed necessity, Strawson sees an unbridged canyon. An event could be order-fixed in perception, yet still lawless, a one-off with no governing rule. Defenders have answered in two main ways, and the dispute remains genuinely open. Lewis White Beck argued Strawson misread the target, since Kant only needs the event to fall under some rule, known or not. Eric Watkins reads the argument through causal powers, where substances ground changes rather than through Humean event pairs. Gaia reconstructs the proof epistemically, as showing causal laws are our only evidence for objective time order. Each reading saves something and pays something, and the literature has not declared a winner. The third analogy completes the set, governing coexistence. To judge that two things exist at the same time, like the moon and the sea, requires more than alternating glances. My perceptions of them merely take turns, moon, then sea, then moon. Judging them simultaneous means taking the alternation as reversible, grounded in things standing in mutual interaction. Everything coexisting in one space must therefore stand in thoroughgoing reciprocal community, each conditioning the others. The principle hands physics its picture of a universally connected nature, every body gravitationally registering every other. One honest footnote belongs here. Relativity later made simultaneity frame dependent, complicating any absolute reading of this analogy, though its core demand for lawful connection stands. Step back and see what the three analogies jointly accomplish. Permanence, lawful succession, and interaction are the skeleton of any world that could be experienced by anyone. Hume's challenge is not merely answered, but inverted. The skeptic granted himself an experienced world, and then doubted its laws. Kant shows the laws are the entry fee for the world. Synthetic a priori knowledge of nature is real, and the lost honour of metaphysics is partly restored. But every principle in the system carries the same invisible stamp, the restriction forged in the schematism. valid for objects in time, meaning valid for appearances, and not 1 inch further. The treasure comes locked to a territory. Kant now turns to survey the border itself, and to name what lies on the far side. The chapter he wrote there contains the most contested concept in his philosophy. Part 10. The Boundary Stone, Phenomena, Noumena, the Thing in Itself, and the Case against Leibniz. The distinction sounds simple when first stated, and the simplicity is a trap. Phenomena are things as they appear, structured by space, time, and the categories. Noumena would be things as they are in themselves, apart from every condition of our access. The trap is the word would. Kant immediately splits the concept of a noumenon into 2 senses, and everything depends on the split. In the positive sense, a noumenon is an object knowable by pure intellect, perhaps by some non-sensory intuition. We have no such intuition, so the positive sense is forever empty for us. In the negative sense, a noumenon is simply a thing considered in abstraction from our way of sensing it. That sense is legitimate, even mandatory, since appearance is a relational word. Something appears. Kant calls the negative concept a boundary concept, a stone marking where knowledge ends, asserting nothing about the far side. Why keep the boundary stone at all, rather than declaring appearances the whole of reality? Kant's reason is built into the Copernican bargain itself. The forms of experience are contributed by us, which only makes sense if something is being formed. Sensibility is receptive, affected from elsewhere, and erasing the elsewhere would turn receiving into inventing. So the thing in itself is not a speculative indulgence, but the anchor of Kant's realism. And yet it generated the first great crisis of his reception, stated by Friedrich Jacobi in 1787. Without the thing in itself, I cannot enter the system, Jacobi wrote, and with it I cannot remain inside. The complaint is sharp. Kant says things in themselves affect us, yet affection sounds like causality, and causality was proven valid only inside experience. Applying the category beyond its schema to ground experience itself looks like Kant violating Kant. That tension drove the central interpretive war of the last half-century, and you should know its map. One camp reads Kant as a two-world theorist. Appearances and things in themselves are distinct sets of entities, a known realm floating above an unknown one. Strawson read him this way and recoiled, calling the unknowable realm a disastrous addition to an otherwise great analysis. James Van Cleve defends the two-world reading as honest exegesis, accepting its costs. The rival camp reads Kant as a two-aspect theorist. There is one set of things considered two ways as they relate to our sensibility and as they are apart from it. Henry Allison built the most influential version, taking the distinction as epistemic, a matter of methodological standpoints. Critics answered that a merely methodological reading drains Kant's idealism of any actual content. Ray Langton proposed a metaphysical middle path, where we know things only through their relational properties, never their intrinsic natures. Lucy Allais defends a similar one-world view, with appearance as genuine manifestation rather than veil. The debate is fully alive in current journals, and no reading dissolves every text. Kant appended to this chapter a sustained demolition of Leibniz, and it belongs to the same argument. The appendix on the amphiboly asks how Leibniz, a genius, went so wrong, and answers with a diagnosis. Leibniz intellectualized appearances, treating objects of sense as if they were objects of pure thought, merely seen confusedly. Make that assumption, and Leibniz's wildest doctrines follow with iron logic. For pure thought, two things sharing every internal property are one thing, since concepts have nothing else to distinguish them. Hence his principle of the identity of indiscernibles. Kant's counterexample is two drops of water, internally identical in every quality. They are still two because they sit in different places, and place is no internal property. Space provides a principle of difference that no inventory of concepts can capture, as the two hands already showed. Leibniz's error was not bad reasoning, but a missed faculty, the failure to see that intuition is not confused thinking. The amphiboly thus closes the constructive half of the book with a warning about method. Every concept must be asked where it belongs, to sensibility or to understanding, before philosophy uses it. Skip the question, and you generate entire metaphysical systems out of a category mistake. Leibniz built upward from pure concepts and got a world of windowless minds. Locke, Kant adds, made the mirror error, sensualizing the concepts of understanding into faded perceptions. Both towers fell because neither surveyed the ground. Stand back, and the completed map looks stable, even serene. Inside the boundary, mathematics and natural science rest on proven foundations. Outside it, a marked silence, guarded by a stone that claims nothing. The serenity is an illusion, and Kant knew it better than anyone. Human reason, by its own inner constitution, cannot stay inside the boundary. It is driven across, not by error or vanity, but by the very principle that makes it reason. The second half of the critique is the anatomy of that drive, and it begins with a discovery. Some illusions survive their own exposure. Part 11. Why Reason Deceives Itself. The Architecture of Transcendental Illusion. Look at a straight oar half submerged in clear water. It appears bent at the waterline, and knowing the optics changes nothing. You can explain refraction in full detail, and the oar goes on looking bent. Kant's deepest discovery in the dialectic is that reason contains illusions of exactly this kind. Not mistakes, which dissolve when corrected, but structural illusions generated by reason's own healthy operation. He calls them transcendental illusions, and he claims they are natural, inevitable, and permanent. Philosophy cannot remove them. It can only map them, the way an astronomer maps why the moon looks larger at the horizon while knowing it is not. To find the source, Kant dissects what reason actually is, as distinct from understanding. Understanding judges, applying concepts directly to experience, one claim at a time. Reason infers, chaining judgments into arguments, asking for the ground of each claim in turn. The rain made the street wet, the front made the rain. The pressure system made the front. Each answer is conditioned, resting on a further condition, and reason's defining demand is to keep asking. Kant states the demand as a maxim. For everything conditioned, seek the condition, and do not stop until the unconditioned is reached. As a research policy, this maxim is the engine of all science, the refusal to accept brute facts. The illusion is born in a single, almost invisible slide. The legitimate maxim says, seek the total series of conditions, treat inquiry as endless. The illegitimate principle says the total series of conditions exists, a completed whole waiting to be known. From a rule for asking, reason slides to a claim about being. Michel Greer's influential study made this distinction the key to the whole dialectic, and most current scholarship follows her. The slide feels like nothing because the two formulations sound alike. But the first governs a process, while the second postulates an object, the unconditioned itself. And the unconditioned, by definition, can never show up in experience, where everything given is conditioned by something further. Reason has manufactured objects that no possible experience could ever contain. Kant then derives exactly which objects get manufactured, and the derivation has a striking shape. Reason's inferences come in three classical forms, and each form, pushed to the unconditioned, generates one idea. Chase the conditions of thinking back through the thinking subject, and you arrive at the idea of the soul. An unconditioned subject, a final bearer of all thoughts that is never itself a predicate. Chase the conditions of appearances outward through the world, and you arrive at the idea of the cosmos. The absolute totality of all appearances, the universe as one completed whole. Chase the conditions of possibility itself, and you arrive at the idea of God, the ground of all possibility, the most real being. Soul, world, God. The entire inventory of classical metaphysics falls out of three inference forms overreaching themselves. This explains the scandal of Part 1, and the explanation has real elegance. Metaphysics never progressed because its objects were never objects. They are horizon points, projections of reason's own demand for completeness, mistaken for things. The horizon comparison is Kant's own kind of image. A horizon organizes everything you see, and you can walk toward it forever. What you cannot do is arrive, because the horizon is a feature of your seeing, not a place. 2,000 years of philosophers had been drawing maps of the horizon and fighting over the coastline. You can watch the same drive operating in present-day science at its outermost edges. Cosmology presses its conditions backward and meets the question of what preceded the Big Bang. Physics seeks a final theory, a complete and unconditioned ground of all laws. These programs are not foolish, and Kant's analysis does not mock them. His point is sharper. The demand for total completion is reason's own structure speaking, and no observation could ever satisfy it. Every answered why produces a new why, because the asking, not the world, is what never ends. Steven Weinberg's dream of a final theory and the persistent question of why those laws, rather than others, rehearse the pattern exactly. The dialectic is therefore not a museum of old errors, but a standing diagnosis, and Kant organizes the autopsy. Each manufactured object gets its own examination, with its own characteristic pathology. The doctrine of the soul commits a fallacy of equivocation, repeated 4 times. the doctrine of the world does something stranger and more violent, splitting reason into open self-contradiction. The doctrine of God commits the subtlest error, building reality out of pure thought. The first autopsy cuts closest to home, because the corpse on the table is you. Part 12. The soul dissolves. The Paralogisms. Rational psychology was a real discipline with a proud method and a single premise. From the bare proposition I think, it promised to derive the nature of the soul by pure reasoning. No observation, no anatomy, just analysis of what any thinker must be. Its conclusions came in 4 steps, each inherited from Descartes and systematized by the Wolffian school. The soul is a substance, a thing rather than a property. The soul is simple, without parts, hence indestructible. The soul is a person identical with itself across all time, and the soul is more certain than matter, knowable while bodies remain doubtful. Substance, simplicity, personality, ideality. From these 4, immortality was the cash value. The doctrine, the whole discipline, existed to underwrite. Kant's critique begins with a concession that makes the demolition more devastating, not less. The premise is true. I think, really must be able to accompany all my representations, as his own deduction proved. Consciousness really is unified, and the unity really is necessary. The question is what that unity entitles you to infer, and Kant's answer is almost nothing. Each of the 4 proofs commits the same fallacy, which is why he calls them paralogisms, formally similar failures. Each trades on an ambiguity, reading a feature of the form of thought as a discovery about a thing. Watch the trick performed on the first and most important proof. In every judgment, the I functions as subject, never as predicate. I think the cup, and nothing thinks me. True, says Kant, but this is a grammatical fact about the role of the I in thinking. The rationalist concludes the I is a substance, an independently existing thing. Substance, recall, is a category, and categories deliver knowledge only through their schemata in intuition. The schema of substance is permanence, something persisting that perception can track. Now look inward and try to find any such persisting object. You find thoughts, feelings, perceptions, a ceaseless stream, and the I that accompanies them all. But the accompanying I is never itself given as an object in the stream. It is the formal point of view from which the stream is had, a perspective, not a thing perceived. Hume looked inside, found no self among the perceptions, and declared the self a fiction. Kant's correction is exact. Hume was right that no self appears, and wrong about the lesson, since the self was never a candidate for appearing. The simplicity proof fails the same way, with one elegant addition. My thought cannot be distributed among many beings, the way a verse could be split among many speakers, 1 word each. A sentence scattered across 10 minds is thought by no one. So the thinking subject must be one and undivided, and the rationalist concludes it is a simple substance, immune to decomposition, hence immortal. Kant grants the unity of the function and blocks the leap to the thing. In the second edition he adds a counterproof against Moses Mendelssohn, who had argued a simple soul cannot perish. Having no parts, it cannot break apart, so it cannot be destroyed. Kant answers with the anticipations of perception from Part 8. Consciousness has intensive magnitude. Degree and degrees can diminish continuously toward zero. A simple soul could die the way a sound fades, not by shattering, but by elongescence, dwindling away. Pure reason cannot even rule out that gentlest of deaths. The result is precise, and its precision is the point. Kant has not proven the soul mortal, material, or unreal. He has proven that the I of the I think is epistemically empty, a form mistaken for an object. About what you are in yourself, the thinker behind the thinking, reason establishes nothing in either direction. Materialism is blocked with the same stroke that blocks spiritualism, since matter too is only appearance. The question of the soul is not answered. It is closed like a window painted onto a wall. The argument's descendants populate current philosophy of mind, often without knowing their ancestry. When Thomas Metzinger argues that no one ever was or had a self, only a self-model, he engages Kant's analysis explicitly. Daniel Dennett's claim that the self is a centre of narrative gravity, an organising abstraction rather than a thing, replays the paralogism diagnosis in cognitive terms. Beatrice Longanesse's recent work reads the first person through Kant against both Descartes and contemporary reductionists. And every neuroscientist who denies a Cartesian theatre, a single inner stage where it all comes together for someone, is enforcing Kant's distinction between the unity of a function and the existence of an inner object. The live dispute is whether Kant conceded too much or too little, not whether his question was the right one. One idea down, two remain, and the next failure has a different and more alarming structure. The soul produces fallacies, arguments that quietly equivocate. The idea of the world as a totality produces something philosophy had never formally charged reason with before. Flawless arguments, meeting flawless arguments, for contradictory conclusions. The universe had a beginning, and the universe had no beginning, each proven. Kant called this the antinomy of pure reason, and he privately said it was what first woke him, even before Hume. Reason is about to be shown at war with itself. Part 13. Reason at war with itself. The Antinomies. The Paralogisms expose bad arguments, and bad arguments can be quarantined. The cosmological idea produces something far worse, and Kant presents it like a trial. 4 pairs of proofs, thesis against antithesis, each side argued with full rigour. Each thesis asserts that the world series closes in a beginning, a simplest part, a free cause, a necessary being. Each antithesis asserts the series runs on without closure, forever conditioned. Kant claims both sides prove their case validly from shared assumptions. If he is right, reason contradicts itself by its own strictest standards. He later confessed it was this scandal, even more than Hume, that first drove him toward critique. Take the first antinomy at full strength, since everything turns on the proofs being genuinely good. Thesis: the world has a beginning in time. Suppose it does not. Then, before this present moment, an infinite series of states has already elapsed, one after another. But an infinite series is precisely one that successive synthesis can never complete. A completed infinity of elapsed states is therefore contradictory. So the world began. Now the antithesis, the world has no beginning. Suppose it began. Then empty time preceded it, and in empty time no moment differs from any other. Nothing could mark one instant as the instant for a world to arise. A beginning in empty time could never be conditioned, so nothing could ever begin, so the world is beginningless. Sit with the discomfort. Each proof attacks the other's conclusion, and each looks sound. The second antinomy runs the same war over matter. Every composite must be composed of simple parts, since thinking away all composition must leave something. Yet nothing simple can exist in space, since every region of space contains regions divisible without end. The third antinomy stages the war over causality, and its stakes are the highest in the book. Thesis: natural causality cannot be the only kind, since every cause needs a prior cause. A series with no first member never completes its explanation, so a spontaneous first cause, freedom, must exist. Antithesis: freedom would be an event escaping all law, shattering the unity of experience. Nature must be a closed causal order, and freedom is impossible. The fourth antinomy fights over a necessary being, demanded by contingency and locatable nowhere, inside the series or out. Kant's resolution begins by splitting the four conflicts into two families. The first two he calls mathematical, since they concern the size and division of the world series. His verdict there is the strangest in the book. Both sides are false. The shared assumption, hidden in every proof, is that the world exists as a completed whole in itself. Grant that, and it must be either finite or infinite, and contradiction follows either way. Transcendental idealism removes the assumption. Appearances exist only within possible experience, and experience is given serially, in the regress from conditioned to conditioned. The world whole is never given, only the task of extending the series. Asking whether it is finite or infinite is asking how big something is that does not exist as a thing. The question does not get answered. It gets dissolved, the way a false presupposition dissolves the question of whether the present King of France is bald. The dynamical antinomies receive the opposite verdict, and the asymmetry is deliberate. Causality and necessity concern existence, not magnitude, and existence can straddle the boundary of Part 10. So both sides may be true, each on its own level. Nature can be causally closed without exception at the level of appearances. And freedom can be real, as a causality of things in themselves, where the categories of time do not reach. The antithesis wins the phenomenal world entire, and the thesis keeps a door no science can close. Kant proves nothing here about actual freedom, only that determinism and freedom are not contradictories. The door stays ajar until Part 17. Kant then draws his boldest methodological conclusion. The antinomy, he says, is an indirect proof of transcendental idealism itself. If the world of appearances were a thing in itself, it would have to be finite or infinite. Both options are demonstrably false, so appearances are not things in themselves. He valued this argument enough to call the antinomy the most beneficial error reason ever fell into. The proofs themselves have taken serious modern damage, and the damage must be displayed. The thesis proof of the first antinomy assumes a completed infinity is contradictory. Georg Cantor's set theory in the 1880s made completed infinite totalities mathematically rigorous and consistent. Bertrand Russell pressed the point against Kant directly, and most mathematicians side with Cantor. Defenders answer that the issue was never abstract sets but traversal, an infinity crossed step by step in time. That exact dispute is alive today under another name. The Callum cosmological argument, revived by William Lane Craig, recycles Kant's thesis proof to argue the universe began. Graham Oppy and Wes Morriston attack it with Cantor's tools, replaying the antinomy in current journals. Cosmology has joined in, asking what preceded the Big Bang and whether the question even passes. Several quantum gravity programs suggest time itself gives out at that boundary, making before ill-formed. That is not Kant's physics. It is Kant's shape of diagnosis, a question dissolving because a condition of its sense runs out. Two cosmological ideas down, one remains, and it is the largest target in the history of philosophy. The fourth antinomy already gestured at a necessary being and could not place it. Reason, refusing the lesson, completes the gesture into a single magnificent object, the most real being of all. Kant's examination of that object is the most consequential 40 pages ever written on God. Part 14. The God of the Philosophers falls, the Transcendental Ideal and the Critique of all Proofs. First watch reason, build the object, because the construction explains every proof that follows. To know a thing completely, you would have to settle every possible predicate, yes or no. Tall or not, charged or not, conscious or not, through the entire space of possibilities. Thoroughgoing determination of anything therefore presupposes the sum total of all possibility as its backdrop. Reason, demanding the unconditioned, condenses that backdrop into a single being containing all reality. Kant names it the ens realissimum, the most real being. Then reason personifies the condensation, and the God of the philosophers stands complete. An idea generated by the logic of determination has been mistaken for an existing individual. Kant's word for the mistake is hypostasis, treating a function as a thing, the paralogism error at cosmic scale. Kant then claims all speculative proofs of this being reduced to exactly 3. You can argue from pure concepts, from existence in general, or from the particular constitution of the world. The ontological, the cosmological, and the design argument. There is no fourth road, and he takes the 3 in order of purity. The ontological argument, from Anselm through Descartes, argues God's existence from God's definition. God is the most perfect being, and a being lacking existence would lack a perfection. So God's non-existence is contradictory, like a triangle without 3 sides. Kant's reply became one sentence every philosophy student learns. Existence is not a real predicate. A real predicate enlarges a concept, adding to the description of a thing. Existence adds nothing to any description. 100 actual thalers, Kant says, contain not one coin more than 100 possible thalers. The concept is identical in both cases. What differs is whether the world contains an object answering to it, and that difference no analysis of concepts can settle. Definitions can fix what God would be. Whether anything is that, only something beyond definition could show. Modern logic largely codified Kant's diagnosis. Frege and Russell rebuilt existence as a quantifier, a claim about whether a concept is instantiated, not a property of individuals. On that analysis, the ontological argument cannot even be formulated in its classical shape. Yet honesty requires reporting the survivor. Alvin Plantinga rebuilt the argument in modal logic, using necessary existence rather than bare existence as the perfection. Necessary existence arguably is a real predicate, since it does describe how a thing exists. Plantinga's version is valid, and everything turns on one premise that a maximally great being is possible. Critics, Oppie foremost, answer that the possibility premise simply restates the conclusion at one remove. Kant's deeper point, that real possibility cannot be purchased by mere consistency, is exactly the live issue. The cosmological argument starts from a fact, and so looks sturdier. Something exists, contingently, and the contingent demands a ground, terminating in a necessary being. Kant files two objections, one familiar and one devastating. The familiar one, the argument rides the category of causality beyond all possible experience, where its schema gives out. The devastating one targets the second half of the proof, where the necessary being gets identified as God. Necessity alone is featureless. To clothe it, the argument must claim that only a most real being could be necessary. That claim, inverted, says the most real being is necessary, which is the ontological argument again. The proof that began in experience secretly cashes its check at the bank of pure concepts. If the ontological argument fails, the cosmological argument fails with it, having no independent funds. The design argument receives something no other target in the dialectic receives: open respect. Kant calls it the oldest, clearest proof, most suited to ordinary human reason, and asks that it never be mocked. Then he measures exactly what it could establish, and the measurement is the refutation. Order and purposiveness in nature, granted in full, point to an architect working on given material. They cannot point to a creator of the material itself, since arrangement is all the evidence shows, and evidence of finite wisdom licenses only a very great designer, never an infinite one. To leap from world architect to all-sufficient God, the argument borrows the cosmological proof, which borrows the ontological. All three roads, Kant concludes, were one road, and it ends at the 100 thalers. The current version of the design argument inherits the same ceiling, and the inheritance is precise. Fine-tuning arguments note that physical constants sit within narrow life, permitting ranges. Grant the inference its strongest form, and it yields a cause of great power adjusting given laws. The distance from that conclusion to a necessary, perfect, unique creator is the distance Kant measured. The modern debate, with multiverse and selection effects on one side, runs inside his frame. State the final result, with both of its edges showing. speculative reason cannot prove God exists. And by the same boundary, speculative reason cannot prove God does not exist. The categories fail in both directions beyond experience, so theoretical atheism is as bankrupt as theoretical theology. The question of God is removed from the domain of proof entirely in either direction. Whether anything else could carry it, something other than knowledge, is deferred to Part 17. The dialectic's demolition is now total, and a suspicious question becomes unavoidable. Soul, world, and God were generated by reason's own structure, necessarily in every human mind. Nature does not usually build organs with no function. If the ideas cannot constitute knowledge, what are they for? Kant's answer rescues them in the last place anyone expected, inside science itself. Part 15, What Reason is Still For, Regulative Ideas and the Unity of Science. Kant's distinction here is between two ways a principle can function. A constitutive principle determines objects, telling you what exists and how it must be. A regulative principle directs inquiry, telling you how to keep searching without asserting anything about objects. The ideas of reason are catastrophes when taken constitutively, as the dialectic proved at length. Taken regulatively, Kant now argues they are the operating system of science. He compares an idea to a focal point behind a mirror. The point does not exist, since no light ever passes through it. Yet every reflected ray organizes itself as if radiating from exactly there. Remove the imaginary point, and the rays lose their order. The idea of completed unified knowledge works the same way. No inquiry ever reaches it, and every inquiry is aimed by it. Kant specifies the aiming through three regulative principles, and each governs working science. The principle of homogeneity commands, seek unity, gather diverse phenomena under ever fewer principles. The principle of specification commands the opposite, seek variety, expect every species to conceal subspecies. The principle of continuity commands gradation, expect intermediate forms, bridging every division. None of these is a finding about nature. No experiment ever showed that nature is one system, and none ever could. They are demands reason places on inquiry, projected as a description of the world. Kant's formula is that we must study nature as if it were systematically unified for our understanding. The history of physics is one long obedience to the first principle. Newton unified falling apples and orbiting moons under a single law. Maxwell unified electricity, magnetism, and light into one field theory. Weinberg, Salam, and Glashow unified electromagnetism with the weak nuclear force, and the Nobel Committee agreed. Today, thousands of physicists pursue the unification of all four forces, with string theory as one candidate. Ask the foundational question, and the Kantian point surfaces. What evidence established that nature must be unified, that one theory awaits at the bottom? None did, and none could, since the claim outruns every possible observation. The conviction is regulative, reason's demand, wearing the costume of a discovery. Abandon it, and research does not become more rigorous. Research stops, since brute unconnected facts would be acceptable resting places. The same analysis covers the quieter virtues scientists invoke when choosing theories: simplicity, elegance, parsimony, the preference for one mechanism over 40. No measurement ever showed that nature is simple, and complexity is never refuted by taste. Yet a theory with 50 arbitrary constants loses to a theory with 3, evidence held equal. Contemporary philosophy of science debates these super-empirical virtues constantly, asking why they should track truth. The Kantian answer remains a live position in that debate. The virtues are regulative demands of reason, constitutive of inquiry rather than descriptive of the world. Hans Weichinger built an entire philosophy, the philosophy of as if, on generalizing this chapter. Even the 3 great ideas of the dialectic return to work, demoted and useful. The idea of the soul directs psychology to treat all mental phenomena as if grounded in one unified subject. The idea of the world directs cosmology to extend the series of conditions without ever halting. The idea of God directs all science to treat nature as if intelligible through and through. That last as if quietly explains a familiar fact about working scientists. Many who hold no theology still proceed on an unshakable commitment that nature makes sense, all the way down. Kant would say they are using the idea exactly correctly, as a lens rather than a portrait. A genuine difficulty in this doctrine should be stated rather than smoothed. Kant says the ideas merely direct inquiry, claiming nothing about objects. He also says inquiry presupposes that nature itself answers to systematic unity, or the direction would be pointless. Those 2 statements pull apart, and scholars from Gerd Buchdahl to current journals argue over the gap. The third critique, 3 years later, exists largely to renegotiate exactly this tension. The argument of the critique is now materially complete, knowledge grounded, illusion diagnosed, the ideas re-employed. What remains is the book's final quarter, the part almost every reader skips. Kant called it the doctrine of method, and it answers a question the whole journey has raised. After critique, what is philosophy itself permitted to be? Part 16. The Doctrine of Method, Discipline, Canon, and What Philosophy Can Never Be. The skipped quarter opens with an image of construction. The doctrine of elements, everything covered so far, was an estimate of building materials. The doctrine of method draws the plan, asking what can actually be built and how. Its first chapter, the Discipline, is a set of prohibitions, and the central one targets philosophy's oldest envy. Philosophy has always envied mathematics, and Kant explains why the envy is fatal. Mathematics constructs its concepts, exhibiting them in pure intuition. Define a triangle, and you can draw one, in imagination or on paper, and the drawn instance carries universal validity. Every property proven on this triangle holds for all triangles, because construction realizes the concept completely. Philosophy possesses no such power. Its concepts, cause, substance, right, cannot be drawn. Philosophical knowledge is discursive, working through concepts, never able to exhibit them in intuition. So mathematics can begin from definitions and march through demonstrations, while philosophy can do neither. Its definitions arrive at the end of analysis, if ever, and its proofs never compel like geometry. Spinoza's ethics, laid out in axioms and theorems like Euclid, is the monument to the confusion. The geometric costume conceals that every axiom is a contestable philosophical claim, undrawable and unproven. The 20th century ran the experiment again at industrial scale. Logical positivism, armed with Frazier's new logic, promised to make philosophy as rigorous as mathematics at last. Carnap announced the elimination of metaphysics through logical analysis of language. Within 30 years, the program collapsed on its own criterion, since the verification principle could not verify itself. The episode reads like a stage confirmation of the discipline. Philosophy, borrowing the method of a construction it cannot perform, ends by refuting itself. The discipline then regulates combat and conjecture. In conflicts of pure reason, Kant rules there is no real victory, as the Antinomies displayed. So polemic is permitted only defensively, and censorship of reason is forbidden absolutely. Reason must submit to critique, he writes, and has no authority except free and open examination. Hypotheses about the supersensible get the same defensive restriction. You may use the soul's possibility to repel a materialist's overreach, never to build a doctrine. And transcendental propositions admit only one kind of proof, from the possibility of experience, never from analogy or probability. Each prohibition cuts off a road metaphysics had worn smooth for centuries. The second chapter, the Canon, pivots the entire system on three questions. What can I know? What ought I to do? What may I hope? The first question is now fully answered, and the answer ended speculative theology and psychology. But Kant observes something remarkable about where the destruction landed. The three great objects of metaphysics, freedom, immortality, God, matter to no one as theory. Their entire weight is practical, bearing on how to live and what to expect from living. Reason's deepest interest was never knowledge. The Canon sketches what the second critique will build, a moral world and a highest good proportioning happiness to virtue. Hope, not proof, is the form in which reason may keep its oldest objects. Part 17 walks through that door slowly. The third chapter, the architectonic, defines what makes knowledge a science. A science is a system, not an aggregate, an organized body where the idea of the whole determines every part. Kant's image is an organism growing from within, rather than a heap assembled by addition. Then he turns the definition on philosophy itself and produces his most quoted classroom remark. Philosophy cannot be learned, since it nowhere exists as a finished body to memorize. Only philosophizing can be learned, the activity of reason examining its own grounds. He distinguishes the scholastic concept of philosophy, technical skill in systems, from its cosmic concept. On the cosmic concept, philosophy is the science relating all knowledge to the essential ends of human reason. The philosopher, so defined, is not an artist of concepts, but a lawgiver of reason. Measured against that office, Kant says, every actual philosopher is a sketch. The book closes with a 3-page history of pure reason, written as a fable of ages. Dogmatism was reason's childhood, confident and despotic, building towers without surveying ground. Skepticism was its nomadic phase, tearing down settlements while founding nothing. Criticism, the third age, is maturity, reason as an adult who knows what its powers can carry. The final sentence invites readers to make the critical path their own, projecting completion within a generation. The estimate was optimistic. The work it assigned is still open. One assignment, though, Kant refused to leave open because everything human hangs on it. The Canon promised that what knowledge surrendered, morality might recover. The third antinomy left freedom merely thinkable, a door ajar in a determined world. The next part is how Kant walks through it, and why he called the whole critique a clearing of ground for this. Part 17. Freedom in a Determined World, what the critique makes possible. Begin with how completely Kant concedes the deterministic picture, because his solution spends the concession. Every human action is an event in time, and the second analogy admits no exceptions. Your choices issue from desires, character, upbringing, neurochemistry, each link caused by prior links. Kant goes further than most determinists dare. If we could see a person's incentives completely, he writes, we could calculate their future conduct like an eclipse. No gaps, no swerves, no exemptions for the will. Any freedom worth having must survive in that world, not in its cracks. Now, set beside the concession, one stubborn fact of moral life. A man tells a malicious lie, Kant's own example, and serious harm follows. Investigators trace the causes fully: a bad upbringing, vicious company, a shameless temperament. The explanation is complete, and something strange survives it. We still blame him. The blame addresses him as though he could have refrained, the entire causal biography notwithstanding. Every ought carries the same structure. Telling someone they ought to have acted otherwise presupposes a power not exhausted by what was. Hume's school dismisses this presupposition as confusion. Kant takes it as data, the voice of a causality that does not borrow its law from nature. The resolution runs through the boundary established in Part 10, and nowhere else could it run. A human being, like everything, can be considered two ways. As appearance, each person has what Kant calls an empirical character, a causal profile fully embedded in nature. That character is what psychology studies, prediction tracks, and the eclipse calculation would read. As a thing in itself, the same person has an intelligible character, outside time, hence outside the reach of every category of nature. Temporal causation cannot bind what is not in time, since causality is valid only through its temporal schema. So one and the same action can be fully determined as an event and free as a deed. Not half determined and half free, but wholly both, under two descriptions that never compete. The critique did not prove freedom real. It proved the accusation of contradiction false, which Kant insists is all theory can deliver and all morality needs. This is the context of the most famous sentence in the book's preface. I had to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. The sentence is quoted constantly and misread almost as often. Faith here is not creed or comfort, but what Kant calls rational moral belief. Freedom, God, and immortality can never be objects of knowledge in either direction for anyone. Precisely that closure protects them, since materialism and fatalism were also knowledge claims, and they died in the same fire. What remains is a commitment licensed by practical reason, held with certainty of a different currency. Kant's formulation is exact and strange. I must not say it is morally certain that God exists, but rather I am morally certain. The certainty is indexed to the standpoint of an agent, and that indexing is the whole doctrine. The objections to noumenal freedom are severe, and they deserve their full weight here. First, the timing problem. The intelligible character is outside time, so the free deed is timeless. But the lie happened on a Tuesday, and responsibility for dated events seems to need a dated exercise of control. How a timeless ground answers for Tuesday is something no Kantian has made fully transparent. Second, the fixity problem, pressed by Schopenhauer, who accepted the doctrine and drew its hardest consequence. If the intelligible character grounds the entire empirical character, then each particular act flows from what I timelessly am. Freedom shrinks to a single foundational self-choice, and within life, Schopenhauer concluded, conduct follows essence. Third, the intelligibility problem, given its modern voice by Peter Strawson. Appeals to a causality outside nature, he argued, are obscure and panicky metaphysics, words without working content. The strongest current defences respond by deflating the two worlds into two standpoints. Christine Korsgaard and Henry Allison read the doctrine practically rather than metaphysically. Deliberating and explaining are two stances no agent can occupy at once. Stand at the chessboard deciding your move, and the predictability of your decision is simply unusable. From inside deliberation, reasons are open, and the move is yours necessarily, on pain of not deliberating. Freedom, on this reading, is the unavoidable self-conception of any rational agent, not a hidden mechanism. Critics answer that a mandatory self-conception could still be false, leaving responsibility hostage after all. The dispute between metaphysical and practical readings of Kantian freedom fills current journals without resolution. Neuroscience joined the argument with data, and the Kantian reply is instructive whatever its success. Benjamin Libet's experiments found readiness potentials in the brain preceding conscious decisions by hundreds of milliseconds. Later work decoded simple choices from brain activity seconds before subjects reported deciding. Headlines announce free will refuted. A Kantian hears the announcement calmly, and the calm is principled rather than complacent. Empirical predictability of action was conceded in advance, completely, at the eclipse level. The framework was built for exactly the world Libet found, so no finding inside time can touch it. Whether that invulnerability is a strength or a warning sign is a fair question to leave open. A theory no possible experiment could disturb has left the territory where experiments rule, which is precisely where Kant placed it. The system is now complete, from the first crisis to the rescued moral agent. What remains is the verdict of time. 245 years of the sharpest minds in philosophy have attacked this building from every side. The final part surveys what they brought down and what is still standing. Part 18. The Living Kant, 200 Years of Objections and the Current Debate. The first wave of objections came within a decade, and it targeted the load-bearing wall. Jacobi's complaint about the thing in itself, met in Part 10, opened the breach. Salomon Maimon, a self-taught Lithuanian genius Kant privately called his sharpest critic, widened it. The deduction proves categories must apply if experience is to be unified, Maimon argued. It never proves that this given sensory material actually submits, leaving a gap between right and fact. The German idealists drew the radical conclusion. Fichte simply deleted the thing in itself, deriving everything from the activity of the eye. Hegel added the objection that still opens every seminar on the subject. To draw a boundary around knowledge, you must already see both sides of it. Calling the noumenal unknowable is itself a claim about the noumenal. So the fence self-destructs. Hegel mocked the whole project as resolving to swim before entering the water, examining cognition before using it. Kantians answer that the boundary concept claims nothing positive, exactly as Part 10 specified. Whether that answer holds is still being litigated, which tells you the wound was real. Schopenhauer mounted the opposite raid, keeping the building and looting one room. He accepted transcendental idealism wholesale, then claimed one secret passage to the thing in itself. In willing, he argued, you know yourself from inside, not as appearance, but as blind striving will. Kant's stricture forbids the move, since inner sense is also temporal, also appearance. Schopenhauer took the passage anyway, and Nietzsche inherited the keys, which is the story this channel has told. By the 1860s, German philosophy's official slogan was back to Kant, and two schools industrialized the return. The Marburg school, Cohen through Cassirer, read the Critique as the logic of mathematical science. The Southwest school, Windelband and Rickert, read it as a theory of validity and values. Then physics detonated the foundations, as Part 4 recorded, and the relativized a priori was the salvage. Logical positivism rose from that salvage and turned on its ancestor. In 1951, Quine's two dogmas of empiricism attacked the analytic-synthetic distinction itself. No principled line separates truths of meaning from truths of fact, Quine argued, only a continuum of revisability. If he is right, the question of Part 2 cannot even be posed, and the critique dissolves before starting. The counterattack has been substantial, from Grice and Strawson onward, and two-dimensional semantics rebuilt a priori in new vocabulary. Current verdict, the distinction survives in chastened forms, and the argument is genuinely unfinished. The analytic rehabilitation of Kant dates from 1 year, 1966, and 2 books. Strawson's The Bounds of Sense, and Jonathan Bennett's Kant's Analytic retranslated the Critique into argument-by-argument English. Strawson's verdict became the era's consensus, a profound analytic core wrapped in disastrous idealism. Keep the deduction's insight, discard the transcendental machinery and the noumenal realm. The next generation reversed the surgery. Henry Allison argued the idealism was the insight, properly read as epistemic modesty rather than veiled worlds. Paul Guyer answered with the most sustained textual assault in the literature, and their war organized 30 years of scholarship. Langton and Allais then built the intermediate positions, Part 10 mapped, where the field currently camps. Meanwhile, Kant quietly conquered territories he never claimed. Wilfrid Sellars attacked the myth of the given, the idea that bare sensation could justify belief. The attack is the Deductions lesson in mid-century dress, and Sellars said so. McDowell's Mind and World renewed it for the 1990s, igniting the Conceptualism War, Part 6 reported. In Ethics, Rawls rebuilt political philosophy on Kantian constructivism in 1971, and Korsgaard and O'Neill built the meta-ethics. Kantian ethics now stands as one of the 3 live programs in the field, which no one predicted in 1900. Cognitive science, as parts 3, 4 and 7 showed, keeps rediscovering the shape of the constructive mind. Even Quantum Foundations hosts a Kantian faction, with Cubism and Bohr's own instrumentalism debated in his vocabulary of conditions of description. The sharpest current challenge is institutional rather than doctrinal, and it should be named plainly. Contemporary analytic metaphysics simply resumed, brilliantly and without apology. Kripke revived essences. David Lewis built a plenum of possible worlds. Williamson defends necessitism with formal tools. Whole journals now adjudicate the fundamental structure of reality, exactly the science Kant declared impossible. From inside the critique, this looks like dogmatism reborn with better logic, categories sailing past all possible experience. From inside the new metaphysics, Kant's verificationist scruples look like a superseded episode. The field of meta-metaphysics exists to fight precisely this battle, and both armies are fully manned. Whether metaphysics is possible remains 2.5 centuries later the openest question in philosophy. That the question is still his question is the measure of the book. So tally the ledger honestly. Fallen, the eternal Euclidean a priori, the exact table of 12, the claim that Newtonian causality is fixed forever. Wounded and fighting, the analytic-synthetic distinction, the thing in itself, noumenal freedom. Standing and load bearing across the discipline, the core discoveries. Experience has conditions the mind supplies, and necessity in knowledge traces to those conditions. Objectivity is constituted by rules, not copied from a ready-made world. Reason generates structural illusions when it chases the unconditioned, and the chase is also the engine of science. Existence is not a predicate, the self is not an object, and the skeptic presupposes the world he doubts. Each of these is a working part of philosophy today, usually without footnotes to its maker. Kant left an image of the position he won, and it can stand as the book's epitaph. The land of truth, he wrote, is an island surrounded by a wide and stormy ocean. The ocean is the native seat of illusion, where fog banks and melting ice counterfeit new shores. Generations of voyagers wrecked themselves on those counterfeits, mistaking horizon for coastline. The critique of pure reason is the survey of the island, completed before any further voyages booked. Its lesson outlasts every refuted detail. Before asking what reality is, ask what must be true of any mind for which there is a reality at all. Philosophy, before this book, asked about the world. Philosophy after it asks about the asking. That reversal has never been reversed.